Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Aristotle Dumas springs a trap so flawless, so merciless, that it doesn't just threaten Newman Enterprises, it obliterates the very foundation of the Newman family. For decades, Victor Newman has ruled with absolute authority, shaping destinies, bending loyalties, and defining what it means to be a Newman. Nick, the son who spent his life torn between rebellion and loyalty, believed that no matter how fierce their battles became, one truth was immutable. Victor Newman was his father. But Aristotle, operating from the shadows with surgical precision, understands something Victor never anticipated, that the most effective way to destroy a king is not to attack his empire, but to shatter his bloodline. The trap begins innocently enough, with Aristotle leaking fragments of confidential Newman medical records into a shell corporation Victor unknowingly acquires, a move so subtle it feels like a clerical error rather than an act of war. Nick, already on edge after sensing Victor's renewed secrecy and Adam's unsettling confidence, stumbles upon inconsistencies during a routine legal review meant to protect the family from a looming corporate threat. At first, the discrepancies seem trivial: dates that don't align, a missing authorization signature, an old hospital reference that doesn't match the timeline Nick remembers hearing his entire life. But Aristotle knows that truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be persistent. As Nick digs deeper, driven by a gnawing instinct that something fundamental is wrong, Aristotle tightens the noose, arranging for Nick to receive an anonymous tip pointing him toward a long-forgotten fertility clinic Victor once used in the 1980s. Back when ambition eclipsed caution and power mattered more than paperwork. Nick confronts Victor casually at first, masking his unease with sarcasm, but Victor's reaction, a flicker of alarm quickly buried beneath bluster, confirms Nick's worst fear. There are secrets here Victor never intended his son to uncover. Meanwhile, Aristotle manipulates events with chilling calm, orchestrating a boardroom crisis that forces Victor to rely on Nick for damage control, all while knowing the emotional bomb he planted is ticking louder with every passing hour. The cruel irony is unmistakable. Victor, the master manipulator, is being played by someone who understands him completely. When Nick finally obtains sealed medical files, released under the guise of a legal subpoena connected to Aristotle's corporate offensive, the truth detonates. The DNA documentation is unmistakable, supported by modern verification and cross-referenced with Victor's own genetic markers. Victor Newman is not Nick Newman's biological father. The revelation hits Nick like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs as decades of memories reconfigure themselves into something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Every argument, every reconciliation, every moment Nick believed he was fighting for his place as Victor's son suddenly feels distorted, like a reflection in shattered glass. Rage follows disbelief, not the explosive kind Nick is known for, but a quiet, devastating fury that settles into his bones. Aristotle's trap is perfect because it offers no immediate enemy to strike, only a truth that cannot be undone. Nick confronts Victor again, this time without pretense, slamming the files onto the desk that has symbolized Victor's dominance for generations. Victor denies nothing because denial would be useless now, but his justification, that blood is irrelevant, that he raised Nick, that being a Newman is about strength, not DNA, only deepens the wound. Nick realizes in that moment that Victor's greatest flaw is not cruelty, but control. Even now, Victor frames the truth as something he chose to withhold, as if Nick's identity were merely another asset to manage. The fallout is immediate and catastrophic. Nikki, blindsided and devastated, struggles under the weight of her own memories, questioning whether she knew more than she ever allowed herself to admit, while Victoria recoils in shock, torn between loyalty to her father and empathy for her brother, and Adam, disturbingly composed, watches the chaos with a mixture of vindication and caution, knowing all too well what it feels like to be defined and rejected by Victor's bloodline. Yet Aristotle's plan extends beyond family implosion. As Nick spirals emotionally, his absence from key negotiations allows Aristotle's proxies to dismantle crucial Newman partnerships, triggering a domino effect that leaves Victor exposed on multiple fronts. What makes the trap so devastating is its elegance. Aristotle never appears, never gloats, never claims victory, because the destruction speaks for itself. Nick, grappling with the question of who he truly is, begins to unravel not because he feels unloved, but because he realizes how much of his life was built in reaction to Victor rather than in pursuit of his own identity. Was his defiance inherited, or was it shaped by years of pushing against a man who might not even be his biological father? The question haunts him as he distances himself from the Newman name, contemplating a future unbound by expectations that suddenly feel illegitimate. Victor, for the first time in his life, faces an enemy he cannot intimidate or outmaneuver: consequence. The truth has stripped him of moral authority within his own family, and no amount of power can force Nick to forgive him. As whispers ripple through Genoa City, alliances shift, enemies circle, and the Newman legacy trembles, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. Aristotle didn't just set a trap, he rewrote history. Nick's discovery isn't merely a shocking twist. It's a reckoning that exposes how fragile identity becomes when the stories we tell ourselves collapse, and as the dust settles, the question lingers ominously in the air. If Nick is not Victor's son, then who is he, and how far will Aristotle go now that he's proven even the mighty Victor Newman can bleed? The aftermath of the revelation does not fade quietly into the background. Instead, it metastasizes, spreading through every corner of Genoa City like a slow-burning wildfire that consumes relationships, loyalties, and long-held beliefs. Nick's shock evolves into something far more dangerous than anger: clarity. For the first time in his life, he sees Victor not as an immovable force of nature, but as a deeply flawed man whose need for control eclipsed honesty, even when it came to the child he raised as his own. This clarity terrifies Victor more than Nick's rage ever could, because anger can be manipulated, negotiated, or outweighed, but clarity cannot. Nick begins pulling away from Newman Enterprises entirely, refusing Victor's calls, ignoring Nikki's tearful attempts at mediation, and rejecting Victoria's carefully worded pleas for unity. To Nick, their concern feels conditional, tethered to the fear of what his departure means for the Newman brand rather than for him as a person. Aristotle anticipates this emotional isolation and exploits it masterfully, arranging for Nick to cross paths with individuals from his past who quietly reinforce the idea that he has always been more than Victor's shadow: former colleagues, old friends, even rivals who respected Nick not because he was a Newman, but because he stood for something different. Each encounter nudges Nick further away from the identity Victor constructed for him, and closer to an unknown future that feels terrifyingly free. Meanwhile, Victor launches his own counteroffensive against the invisible enemy who humiliated him so thoroughly. He deploys private investigators, legal teams, and international contacts, desperate to unmask Aristotle and regain some semblance of control, but every lead dissolves into dead ends, shell companies, and proxies who vanish the moment they are traced. The more Victor pushes, the clearer it becomes that Aristotle planned for every contingency, predicting Victor's responses with unnerving accuracy. This psychological chess match drains Victor's resources and his confidence, forcing him to confront the possibility that his era of dominance may be ending. Nikki, caught in the crossfire, faces her own reckoning as fragments of her past resurface, memories she buried beneath years of sobriety and survival. She questions whether the truth was ever fully hidden from her, whether some part of her always suspected that Nick's paternity was more complicated than Victor allowed, and the guilt threatens to consume her as she realizes that silence, even unintentional, can be a form of betrayal. Her attempts to reach Nick grow more desperate, culminating in an emotional confrontation where she admits that the Newman name may have protected them, but it also imprisoned them, and Nick finally breaks, confessing that what hurts most is not that Victor isn't his biological father, but that everyone allowed him to believe a lie because it was convenient. Adam, watching from the margins, experiences a disturbing sense of déjà vu, the very thing that defined his own fractured relationship with Victor. Truth withheld, identity questioned, love rationed, has now claimed Nick as well. Yet instead of gloating, Adam feels an unexpected kinship, offering Nick a rare moment of honesty by admitting that blood never guaranteed Victor's approval, and sometimes it only sharpened the knife. This fragile moment between brothers hints at a possible alliance, one that terrifies Victor and intrigues Aristotle, who understands that a united front between Nick and Adam could reshape the power dynamics of Genoa City entirely. As weeks pass, the media begins to sniff around the edges of the scandal, fueled by anonymous tips that ensure the story never quite goes public, but never quite disappears either. The uncertainty keeps Newman Enterprises stock volatile, partners uneasy, and Victor constantly on the defensive. Nick, meanwhile, embarks on a personal investigation of his own, determined to uncover the identity of his biological father, not out of longing but out of necessity. He needs to know where he comes from to decide where he's going. What he uncovers is both mundane and heartbreaking, a man long deceased, unremarkable, unaware that his genetic legacy would one day upend one of Genoa City's most powerful families. The knowledge brings Nick an unexpected peace, reinforcing the realization that fatherhood is defined by choices, not chromosomes, even as it cements his decision to step away from Victor permanently. Aristotle's endgame begins to crystallize as he subtly positions himself to acquire weakened Newman assets through intermediaries, not to claim them openly, but to dismantle Victor's empire piece by piece, proving that even legends can be erased. Yet the greatest irony of Aristotle's trap is that it inadvertently frees Nick, stripping away the expectations that chained him to a legacy he no longer recognizes. In the final moments of this arc, Victor stands alone in his office, staring at a family portrait that now feels like a relic from another life, while Nick walks out into a future undefined by the Newman name. The truth has come out, the trap is closed, and nothing in Genoa City will ever be the same again, because some revelations don't just change the game, they end it. As the dust continues to settle, the emotional shockwaves only deepen, revealing consequences no one fully anticipated, not even Aristotle himself. Nick's decision to distance himself from the Newman family begins to transform from a personal boundary into a seismic shift across Genoa City. His absence leaves a vacuum not just at Newman Enterprises, but in the moral center of the family. For years, Nick was the bridge between Victor's ruthless pragmatism and Nikki's fragile hope for harmony. Without him, old resentments resurface unchecked. Board meetings grow colder, alliances more transactional, and Victor's once unquestioned authority fractures as executives quietly wonder whether the Newman legacy is finally cracking beyond repair. Victoria, thrust into an even more prominent leadership role, feels the weight of expectation crushing down on her. She loves her father, but she cannot ignore the echo of Nick's pain in every decision Victor makes, and slowly, painfully, she begins to question whether loyalty to Victor means sacrificing her own integrity. Aristotle watches all of this from afar, fascinated not just by the strategic success of his plan, but by the psychological unraveling it has triggered. He never intended to replace Victor as a tyrant. His goal was always exposure, to prove that power built on secrets is inherently unstable. Nick's liberation, though unintended, becomes the most powerful symbol of Aristotle's philosophy, that truth, once unleashed, cannot be controlled by even the strongest hands. Nick's journey inward becomes just as compelling as the chaos he leaves behind. Stripped of the Newman identity that once defined him, he confronts a frightening silence where certainty used to live. He questions his instincts, his leadership style, even his moral compass, wondering how much of who he is was shaped by defying Victor rather than understanding himself. This existential reckoning pushes Nick to reconnect with people and causes he abandoned long ago: community initiatives, environmental projects, and humanitarian ventures that once gave him purpose before corporate wars consumed his life. In these quieter spaces, Nick rediscovers a version of himself that feels authentic, grounded, and unburdened by legacy. The irony is not lost on him. Losing his name has given him his voice. Yet the pain lingers, surfacing unexpectedly in memories of childhood moments with Victor. Fishing trips, hard-earned praise, rare flashes of pride that now feel both real and false at the same time. Nick wrestles with the truth that love can exist alongside deception, and that acknowledging one does not erase the other. Back at the Newman ranch, Nikki's struggle intensifies as guilt and grief intertwine. She replays the past relentlessly, searching for signs she missed, moments where she could have asked harder questions or demanded honesty. Her fear is not just that she failed Nick, but that she enabled Victor's pattern of control by choosing stability over truth. This realization shakes her sobriety to its core, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable fact that survival sometimes came at the cost of transparency. In a raw, emotional confession to Victoria, Nikki admits that protecting the family often meant protecting Victor's lies, and that burden has become unbearable. Victoria, shaken by her mother's vulnerability, begins to see the family narrative through a new lens, one where silence is as damaging as betrayal. This shared reckoning between mother and daughter plants the seeds of a quiet rebellion, not against Victor as a father, but against the culture of secrecy he cultivated. Adam's arc takes an equally complex turn. Long defined by his outsider status, Adam finds himself unexpectedly centered in the family drama. Nick's revelation forces Adam to confront his own resentment, realizing that while he fought desperately for Victor's acknowledgement, Nick was unknowingly imprisoned by it. This understanding softens Adam in ways no one expects, including himself. When he reaches out to Nick again, their conversations are no longer charged with rivalry, but with mutual recognition of trauma inflicted by the same man in different ways. Together, they begin to explore the radical idea that being brothers does not require Victor's approval or even his presence. This fragile alliance unsettles Victor deeply because for the first time, his sons are defining themselves outside his gravitational pull. Aristotle observes this development with keen interest, recognizing that unity born of truth is far more dangerous than division fueled by lies. Victor, meanwhile, enters the most perilous phase of his life, not because he is weak but because he is exposed. Every move he makes now is scrutinized, every decision interpreted through the lens of deception. His attempts to regain control grow increasingly desperate, oscillating between paternal appeals and authoritarian commands, neither of which land the way they once did. Alone in his office late at night, Victor confronts a truth he has avoided his entire life. Fear drove him more than ambition ever did. Fear of loss, fear of vulnerability, fear that without control, he would be nothing. The realization terrifies him because it offers no enemy to defeat, no deal to broker. For the first time, Victor must face the possibility that redemption cannot be forced. It must be earned, and he may be too late. As Aristotle's long game reaches its final stages, the financial implications become impossible to ignore. Strategic leaks, timed acquisitions, and subtle market manipulations converge, leaving Newman Enterprises financially bruised but not destroyed, a deliberate choice. Aristotle never wanted annihilation. He wanted transformation. By leaving the empire standing but humbled, he ensures Victor must live with the consequences of his choices rather than escaping them through collapse. In a private moment, Aristotle reflects on his own motivations, revealing that his war with Victor was never personal, but philosophical. To Aristotle, Victor represents a world where power excuses deception, where legacy justifies cruelty. Exposing Nick's paternity was not an act of vengeance, but a statement. Truth is the only force that cannot be negotiated. The climax arrives not with a dramatic showdown, but with a quiet, devastating encounter. Nick returns to the ranch one final time, not to confront Victor, but to say goodbye. The conversation is restrained, heavy with unspoken emotion. Victor, stripped of his usual bravado, admits that keeping the truth from Nick was the greatest mistake of his life, not because it cost him power, but because it cost him trust. Nick listens, unmoved but not cruel, and responds with a truth of his own. Forgiveness may come one day, but reconciliation requires honesty. Victor is only beginning to understand. As Nick leaves, Victor realizes that for the first time, he cannot follow, cannot fix, cannot control the outcome. The door closes softly, yet the sound echoes like thunder. In the final moments of this sweeping arc, Genoa City, stands changed. The Newman name still carries weight, but it no longer commands unquestioned loyalty. Nick steps into a future defined by choice rather than inheritance. Victoria and Nikki quietly reshaped the family's internal dynamics, prioritizing transparency over dominance. Adam, no longer alone, finds strength in shared truth. And Victor Newman, the